So, after analyzing the religious and social motivations surrounding the making and maintaining of family units, we can see what kind of generational, economic, and cultural tensions were in place in Florentine society at this time um, surrounding family life. As you'll see from the Michael Rock readings, the construction of Florentine families had important implications for the practice of male and female sexuality inside and outside the marriage unit. It encouraged the practice of what we might call liminal spaces of sexuality, and thus we come to a discussion of homosexuality and sodomy in Renaissance Florence, and the important distinctions between the two. First, I need to make it clear that the way we today generally define homosexuality, that is, a man's stated preference for amorous and sexual relationships exclusively with other men, as a way of living and self-expression, didn't really exist as a concept in Renaissance Florence. What some people might term the practice of homosexual acts, in our modern parlance, or sodomy, or in its more frequent form involving an older man and a younger boy, pederasty, this in Renaissance Florence was certainly common, very common, enough so, in fact, that the German word for Florentine, Florenzer, um, became synonymous with sodomite. I want to underline that sodomite, or sodomitical acts, as they were understood by people of the period, were not in any way linked to being gay or gay culture as we think of it. In fact, if sodomitical acts were perceived to have taken place, even within the bounds of a marriage, the offending party could be condemned, as that kind of sexual relation was seen as aberrant, just as all sexual relations not specifically engaged in for the purpose of procreation were deemed aberrant by the Catholic Church. But the larger problem, the problem that in the 15th century would attract so much condemnation from both sacred and secular officials, was the widespread practice of sodomy among young men, or between older men and youths. As the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah had long indicated, the practice of such quote-unquote sinful activity had long been condemned by Scripture and the Church, and throughout the Middle Ages, the punishment for convicted sodomizers in Italy was often to be castrated or burnt alive. Beginning in the 1300s, a series of statutes were passed in Florence that were designed to root out the practice. It is important to clarify, however, that until this point, say the mid-1300s, the harshest penalties were meted out to those who were convicted of pederasty and child abuse. So these were harsh punishments designed to excise the violent sodomizers, participants of rape, really, from the community. But in the following century, in the 1400s, authorities, both religious and secular, started taking aim at an altogether different form of sodomy, one which was really very widely practiced and which many Florentines defended as a venerated tradition. In polite conversation, it was referred to as the unmentionable vice, but Florentines had many slang terms for it. Double entendres are a notable feature of the Tuscan language, and knight was one of these terms. Thus, the establishment of the office of the knight, as it was so called, in 1432, was designed to track down and punish sodomizers. Sodomy, as it was practiced in Renaissance Florence, usually involved an encounter between a young man in his late teens or early 20s and a boy in his early teenage years, or else a much older man and a teenage youth. In some ways, sodomy had more to do with the release of sexual tension than it did for any inherent preference for the sexual company of men. As we have seen, young girls were married off early, and when they were, they became part of their husband's household, and for much of their time they remained inside the family home. And while pregnancy out of wedlock certainly did happen, it would bring the utmost shame on a family and irreparably damage a girl's chances of marrying, or marrying well. Thus, young girls were very jealously guarded by their families, and young men, on the other hand, for reasons previously discussed, were often prevented from marrying until their late 20s or 30s. The result, of course, is that you have a city full of young hormonal men who have very little access to female companionship. When older men or older teens took the active, let's say, role, the active role, this is how Michael Rock talks about it, in sexual relationships with younger teenage boys, they were not in any way emasculated. So rather, as the active participant, the older person in the couple, they would be really confirming their masculine role, just as if they were coupling with a female. The younger passive male, however, was considered emasculated. His role was seen as really being female. So, however, by the time the youth, the younger heretofore passive participant became 18, or right around that age, his role generally switched to being the active partner with younger passive participants. So thus it confirmed his masculinity and acted as a sort of rite of passage. Scholars they used to equate the proliferation of pederasty in Florence in the 15th century with the rise of neoclassical studies, drawing a neat line between, let's say, male scholars who were rediscovering the classical art and texts of ancient Greece and Rome, where pederasty was an ordinary, if not integral part of the culture, with its practice in Renaissance Florence. Certainly, some contemporary educated Florentine men might have flattered themselves by thinking that in having these intimate relations with young men, they were aping the behavior of the ancient Greeks and Romans. But mostly sodomy and pederasty were just a part of Florentine culture going back centuries. A surge of religious fervor and particularly charismatic preaching brought about a concerted effort to rein in the practice of sodomy in Florence. San Bernardo of Siena, for example, was a very fiery preacher, and his sermons drew hundreds and thousands of spectators. And he, like other preachers, railed against sodomy as an unnatural act. Really since the time of Thomas Aquinas, the Church's position had been to kind of lump sodomy together with all the other unpardonable sins that derive from unnatural acts, even such as bestiality. Later in the 15th century, the anti-sodomy torch was taken up by the fanatic priest Savonarola, who you will read more about in this week's readings and in the readings for next week. So the combination of the rise of religious fanaticism in Florence, along with the local government's determination to curb the vice in the policing done by the Office of the Knight, meant that perpetrators of homosexual acts were really more assiduously prosecuted than in previous centuries. But despite the many statutes that were passed by the rulers of Florence and the railing of religious leaders, the practice of sodomy actually persisted in Florence into the early modern period. After periods of instability in Florentine politics, in which the Medici were run out of town in 1494, and then two republics briefly ruled Florence before the definitive return of the Medici in 1533. So in the 16th century, Michael Rock argues that a combination of shifts in the makeup in Florentine society and politics and people's attitudes towards religion meant that after sort of brief periods in which sodomy was alternately ruthlessly punished or then relatively ignored in Florence, a law passed by Cosimo I de' Medici, the first Grand Duke, in 1542, issued across-the-board punishments for those who participated in homosexual acts, regardless of their social station. So for the first time, passive participants were also punished, and repeat offenders were fined 100 scudi, and then they were sentenced to row, essentially, in the Grand Duke's new navy as galley slaves for life. So The effect of this law was not that homosexuality in early modern Florence ceased to be practiced, really quite the opposite. Um, but in many ways it became less public and less visible, and therefore less actively policed. Michael Rock goes into much greater detail in this week's readings, and Alessandro Strozzi's letters should give you some really interesting information about family life, marriage, and power in Renaissance Florence. Um, as you read, keep in mind the way that Florentine society was structured, and you may also wish to think about that Brucker reading from last week. So think of all the outside forces such as frequent warfare, invasions, plague, famine, and other calamities that shaped Florentine life in the 15th and 16th centuries that might have impacted the way contemporary people thought about and treated these issues of sexuality.